There is a huge gap in the due diligence that's done on most commercial real estate transactions. That the gap is huge and it causes a lot of problems. So there's a lot of lawsuits, there's a lot of misery because a good job of due diligence isn't done before a commercial real estate transaction closes. So if you're investing in commercial real estate, or you're purchasing commercial real estate, or commercial real estate is important to your business operations or your organization's operations, you need to know, what is the gap, why does it exist, and how do you cover the gap? How do you close the gap? So before we talk about the gap, let's just explain what is due diligence in this context. So due diligence is basically going in to ask all the questions that need to be asked to find out about potential problems or risks in a commercial real estate transaction, right? And so you want to identify and mitigate those risks, fix potential problems before you purchase a parcel. And I tell people frequently, there's not very many problems in commercial real estate that cannot be fixed, with the right team and the right amount of money and an appropriate amount of time. So, the problems that we find in commercial real estate don't necessarily have to blow up the deal. Sometimes they do blow up the deal, but they don't have to blow up the deal. And as a buyer, you want to get those problems fixed before the sale closes. And if you do find a major problem during due diligence, that allows you to go back and possibly negotiate a reduction in price from the seller. So what is this gap in commercial real estate due diligence that I talk about? The gap is basically questions that just aren't asked in your typical real estate transaction. And the fact that those questions don't get asked, like I said, causes a lot of misery and suffering. So there's this huge basket of issues that don't get looked at before a real estate transaction closes. So what's included in the gap? I'm going to give you a list here of 4 things that we see on a regular basis that just get missed. They're just not thought about or talked about or solved. These problems aren't talked about or identified or solved in the typical due diligence, commercial real estate due diligence process that we see. So here's the 4 things. First one is boundary surveying issues. The second one is land title issues. The third one is land use regulation issues. And the fourth one is flood hazard issues. I would say the first 3 are the big 3. The flood hazard stuff isn't as huge of a deal, but it does come up a lot, especially in areas where we work in California, where we have we have coastal properties and we have flooding here in the Central Valley. Okay, so those are the types of issues that are frequently overlooked during real estate due diligence. So the bank's getting an appraisal, somebody's getting a building inspection, somebody's checking the box on hazardous waste, but nobody's finding out if the property's been surveyed, if there's potential building encroachments, if there's legal access to a public road. A lot of those questions aren't being asked. So why does that gap exist? I think there's 3 reasons why the gap exists. One has to do with just ignorance. The other has to do with bad incentives. And the third thing has to do with just false advertising, right? And I'm going to call that out. It's going to probably irritate some people or make some people angry, but I think it needs to be done. Okay, so the first reason why the gap exists is just ignorance. Okay, and I'm gonna just explain to you, the ignorant parties on the typical land transaction, and I'm gonna go from most ignorant to least ignorant. Okay, when I say ignorant, I don't mean that in a derogative or demeaning or insulting way. By ignorant, I just mean a lack of knowledge. Okay, so the buyer is ignorant. A lot of times, they're probably the most ignorant party involved in the transaction, and I don't fault them for that. I take my pickup truck to a good mechanic because I don't know how to work on cars. I'm ignorant in that way. So I go to a professional that I trust. So that's what the buyer's doing. They've assembled a team of supposedly trusted professionals because they don't have the knowledge. So the buyer's ignorant. The broker, the real estate broker, I'm often surprised at how ignorant the real estate broker is about a lot of issues related to due diligence. That is something that has disappointed and frustrated me as I've gotten older and spent more time in the real estate industry. But I think I don't necessarily blame the brokers for that. I think there's some good reasons for it. I'll talk about that in a minute. that has to do with incentives. But I'm oftentimes surprised at the lack of just basic knowledge that brokers have about boundary and land title and land use planning issues. The third is the bank. The bank is often ignorant. They're usually less ignorant than the broker or the buyer, but there's still, I find, a lot of ignorance at the banks that are funding these transactions. And again, I don't blame the people working at the bank for that. Real estate is complicated. I think a lot of people in the banking industry work themselves into a role where they're now reviewing or approving commercial real estate transactions, and they probably haven't been properly trained to do that. And just to give you an example, we were working on a potential transaction here a few months ago, and the bank that was involved, it's one of our local banks. They're a good bank. And the lady at the bank that was going to be approving the transaction, we asked her, hey, what's the Table A items that you need for this title survey? And she said, what's a Table A? That's somebody that just is completely in the dark about what they, the types of questions they need to be asking about boundary surveying and land title and land use. And it's just, it's not her fault. She hasn't been trained to do that. Okay, and then finally, there's the attorney. As a general rule, the attorneys are probably the least ignorant of all the parties involved in the transaction, but I am also regularly surprised at the questions I get from attorneys that are working on due diligence in a real estate transaction. I've talked about that in some of our other videos, but just as an example, attorneys will ask me things like, your survey showed this problem, but the assessor map doesn't show that problem. Why doesn't your surveyor look like a tax assessor map? And that just demonstrates a complete lack of understanding about tax assessor maps and what they're used for and the way land title works in the United States. So, and I think I see that most typically see that when I've got attorneys that are not specialized in real estate law doing due diligence. So, it's the corporate attorney, or it's somebody's, uncle's a family law attorney and they're doing the due diligence. If real estate law is complicated enough that you really need to specialize in that if you're doing due diligence. So, there's even land attorneys that don't understand some basic things about boundary surveying and land title, but that becomes more of a problem with attorneys that don't focus on that type of law. And I often find in the deals that I'm working on, the real estate deals, that we're dealing with a kind of general law or business law attorney that's representing the business or the corporation, and they just don't have the expertise to ask the right questions. So that's one reason the gap exists: ignorance. The second reason the gap exists, I think, is just bad incentives, and primarily the bad incentives are in the real estate brokers' court. And I told you before, I don't really blame the brokers for the ignorance that they sometimes demonstrate. I think it's part of how we pay real estate brokers in the United States. I think it's a really bad system. So they basically get paid when they close the transaction, and it's typically a percentage of the transaction cost. What that means is brokers have the incentive to close the deal. If they don't close the deal, they don't get paid. And they want to close the deal usually as quickly as they can. So the quicker they can close the deal, the more money they're going to make in any given year. And so that means they have an incentive to not ask questions that might blow up the deal, right? So in that particular way, the interests of the real estate broker are not well aligned with the interests of the buyer. That's a problem with how we pay real estate brokers in the United States. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but in this particular conversation, but that's an issue. So there's just a bad incentive there. I think the title company doesn't always have great incentives. The title company wants to sell you title insurance for as much money as possible while exposing themselves to as little risk as possible. And so, in that sense, the title insurance company is not always looking out for the buyer's interests. That's why you need somebody that has a fiduciary duty or professional duty to the buyer to kind of manage the title company in a transaction. So there's just some bad incentives there. I don't think the banks or the attorneys, I think their incentives are more closely aligned with the clients, but certainly the brokers, both the buyer's broker and the seller's broker and the title company, don't always have incentives that align well with the buyer's incentives or the buyer's interests. And then the third reason I think the gap exists is just there's some false advertising. I think the false advertising is partly based on the bad incentives, but I think there are real estate brokers that pretend that they're just going to take care of everything their client needs on a real estate transaction. And I don't think that's true. I think brokers should be more honest about what it is that they're going to do and what they're not going to do. And when I say be honest, I don't mean like have it in the small print in your real estate contract. That's not the kind of honesty I'm talking about. When I talk to clients, especially in situations where a commercial real estate transaction has gone sideways, they are oftentimes frustrated because they felt like their broker was making sure that these types of problems don't happen, and then after the problem happens, the broker says that wasn't my job. But I don't think brokers do a good job of having that conversation up front. It's just based on my experience in the real estate industry. There's bad brokers and good brokers, I know that. But I'm oftentimes surprised at how many clients I deal with after sales close that are very upset with their broker because they feel like the broker gave them the impression that they were going to be doing a job that they weren't in fact doing. So I think there might be a little bit of false advertising there. Even if that's too strong of a term, there's certainly some very embellished marketing happening, and I think that could be harmful. I also think that there's some misconceptions about what title insurance covers. Title insurance is really important, and I've talked in some of my other videos about why you want to hire a good title company and work with a good title officer, but there are some very widespread misconceptions in the real estate industry about what exactly title insurance covers. And I think people forget that title insurance companies are insurance companies, and one thing insurance companies do is deny claims. That doesn't mean that title insurance companies will never pay a claim, but the coverage that you get with title insurance is for a very specific, narrow set of problems. And I don't think most people that buy title insurance fully understand that. And I don't want to get into the weeds, but just, briefly, title insurance does not cover most problems I would find with a survey. It just doesn't. And so I think most people believe that it does. And I don't know that title companies do a good job of making sure people understand the limits of the product they're selling. Again, I don't think they have an incentive to do that. I think there are some title companies that are perfectly content to allow people to think that their product covers more than it actually does. That leads to some unhappy people when claims get denied, but it's part of how the industry works. I think it needs to change. That's part of what I'm trying to do with these videos is help people understand, get a good title company, get title insurance, but understand what it covers and what it doesn't cover. So I think there's some, if there isn't false advertising, I think, there are professionals in the real estate industry that kind of bury some really important information in the fine print, and that doesn't help their clients. So those are the three reasons why the gap exists. There's just ignorance, there's bad incentives, incentives that don't properly align with the buyer's interests, and there's just some degree of false advertising or embellished marketing, or just turning a blind eye to some of the misconceptions people have about the job that brokers do and about what title insurance covers. So, as an example of this gap and why it's kind of crazy that we have this gap in commercial real estate due diligence. If you think about your typical commercial real estate transaction, somebody's hired an appraiser. Why do they hire an appraiser? They hire an appraiser to get a good appraisal, quality appraisal. In a typical transaction, somebody's hired a building inspector. Why do they hire a building inspector? Well, they want to get a quality building inspection. They want to know if there's problems with the building. But then those same parties that are involved in the transaction will turn around and not get a survey. They won't talk to a private land planner. They won't get competent, qualified advice about land title issues. If you're going to hire a building inspector or an appraiser, why wouldn't you hire a boundary surveyor? It doesn't make any sense to me, right? So you can't expect if you're a buyer or an attorney representing a buyer, or a bank who's financing a deal, you can't expect the real estate broker to go in and ask and answer all the questions about boundary surveying and land title and land use regulations and flood hazards. The broker's probably not qualified to do that. The title insurance company certainly isn't qualified to answer all those questions. And we talked before about they don't necessarily have the right incentives to protect either the buyer or the lender. So hire somebody that's going to go ask those questions, right? And so that gets us to the kind of the last part of the conversation, which is how do you fix the gap? So hopefully in this video, I've convinced you that that gap exists, right? There's a gap in the due diligence we do for commercial real estate. How do we fix the gap? How do you cover the gap? Hire a good boundary surveyor and a private land planner. Most good boundary surveyors that work in private practice also do land use planning. Hire that surveyor and have them help you with the due diligence. That's how you close the gap, right? Don't listen to your broker when the broker or the title insurance company tells you, don't worry about it, you don't need a survey. That's not true. In almost every case, if you are involved in a commercial real estate transaction, the prudent and wise decision is to get a good boundary survey. Get a land title survey. That's what you need to do in almost all cases. So work with a good boundary surveyor. The other thing I would tell you is if you're involved in commercial real estate transactions, you should hire a land attorney to do your due diligence. Don't expect your corporate attorney or the attorney that handles your intellectual property and your employment law. Don't expect that attorney to do a good job of due diligence on a commercial real estate transaction. They haven't been trained for that. That area of the law is very complicated. They don't specialize in it. They're not going to do a good job. They're just not. I'm not going to do a good job working on my V6 EcoDiesel engine in my 2019 Dodge Ram. I'm just not. I haven't been trained. I'm not qualified. I have no idea how that piece of machinery works. Your general law attorney is not going to understand real estate law to the degree needed to do a good job of your due diligence on commercial real estate transactions. So hire a good boundary surveyor, hire a good land attorney to do your due diligence. If you're in California or Nevada and you need help with that, reach out to us and we can help you with that. We can help you find a good land attorney. So don't be a victim of the gap in commercial real estate due diligence. If you find yourself in that gap with the problem, it is not a fun place to be.